17 листопада продовжуємо.
It's November 17. Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation. My name is Svetlana Shaparenko, and right now we'll be talking about the protection of our power grid against Russian terror and how we reinforce it and make it stronger. Joining us today in the studio is Volodymyr Kudrytskyi, the chairman of the board of the national energy company Ukrenergo. So good afternoon. Good afternoon. So the enemy doesn't leave its efforts to bomb us back into the darkness, but every day we become stronger in terms of our air defense and reinforcement of our power grids. So can you please tell us what Ukrenergo has done to make our system stronger, to protect it, to defend our power grid against Russian attacks? Thank you for the question. So within the month after the end of the massive strikes, let me remind you, the latest massive strike of the power grid happened in March this year. So we've done a work that we did not expect to have done by the end of this year. We renewed the 95% of functionality of all of our substations. More than 40% of the main aerial lines were damaged during the last campaign of strikes by Russian Federation. We've repaired more than 1,000 kilometers of aerial lines since that time. So we can say that in case of damage of power grid at the level of 40 to 50%, the power grid that was built 40 to 50 years ago, within a couple of months we were able to renew the operation or resume the operation of all of our or 95% of our substations, and from quarter to 1/3 of all of the aerial lines operated by Ukrenergo. We either repaired it or just rebuilt it from scratch. And when we talk about those built from scratch, those were the facilities that were densely mined in the freshly deoccupied territories and located close to the forward edge of the battle area. And we had to first demine them before we could proceed to work, before the repair teams could even get there. And this year, comparing to the previous year, 3.5 times we've increased the emergency provisions of materials and parts. We've increased our capability to restore and rebuild the power grid in case the drone and missile attacks will continue this year. And to exercise such works, we were in need of financial resources. We've raised grants and loans from our foreign donors and partners, and the grant component amounts to $350 million, which are the money that are not supposed to be repaid. So we've channeled those funds for the repairs and settlements in the energy market to make sure that other players can make use of our capability to raise financial resources from Western banks, from Western financial institutions, and repaying our debts in the market. We've created conditions for the electric power stations so they could invest that money in repairing of their energy generators or power generating facilities that were affected by the previous year and this year's attacks. So now we've segregated 3 levels of protection. First is the protection against shrapnel and shockwave. Another level of protection is the protection against direct strike of a drone such as Shahed drone. And third level of protection is the complex protection against missile and drone strikes. So now the first level is, or I would say, updating of the first level is already finalized. Talking about the second level of protection, we found financial resources from our foreign donors. We were not going to make any budget funds for this purpose. The budget funds can be forwarded for other important needs of the state. So again, we were able to find those funds available from our foreign partners. And so that you understand the scale of this work, I have to mention that concrete alone to construct all the protection facilities only is required in amount of 300,000 cubic meters. So it's a huge amount of construction that we are about to finalize shortly, just a couple of months. So can you please give us the details? How is it technically exercised? Is it like a shelter for the power plant or what? Well, I cannot disclose any details. It will be a surprise for the enemy in case they resort to repeating their attacks. But talking about second and specifically third level of protection, those are pretty solid big structures that protect critical parts of the power plants against missile or drone strike. So in fact, Ukrenergo substations will be the first facilities in the world, probably not only in Ukraine, that will be protected with this type of protection. And I can say that there is a huge interest to these technical engineering solutions that were invented by us in coordination with the General Staff and Agency on Reconstruction and Recovery. And I think that in the confidential mode we will continue advising different partners, different countries, how to protect the critical infrastructure facilities such as electric power plants or the electric substations. Well, talking about the future, we clearly understand that after the winter that is coming in a couple of weeks, there will be an immense number of winters we will have to survive, and our mad neighbor is not getting anywhere from us. This is why we have to think not only about the winter to come, but also about some more remote future. Obviously the next winter will be difficult, but we are ready to survive it. The power grid will survive, it's not going to collapse. Obviously there may be some problems arising in case of shellings, but within the following years we have to come to realization of the fact that we cannot keep repairing the damaged old power plants. It's just technically impossible. And on top of that, it's unfeasible. And the best protection for Ukrainian generation facilities is the dissemination. So instead of one facility with 1,000 or 2,000 gigawatts capacity, we better have 10 of them disseminated all across the country with lower capacity, and those facilities should work under using new technologies without the use of such expensive fuel as gas or coal. So they should represent the facilities of the green transition. So as an operator, we have a concept of developing of our power grid within the next 5, 10 to 15 years. What we are supposed to build in our power grid to make sure that our energy generating facilities are protected against the strikes of the enemy, and how to make this energy mix cheaper for the consumer and ecologically cleaner. We make our calculations with the complicated software, and every minute we make a model of the next 10 years. We want our power grid to comply with two criteria. First, at any moment of time, it should be capable of satisfying the demand of consumers for electric power. And second, it should be the cheapest out of all of available options. We see that to make it cheaper for Ukrainian consumers, for Ukrainian businesses, in the long-term perspective, we have to continue building the renewable power source-based power plants. I mean, the sun and wind energy, but at the same time, we need controlled generation in maneuverable facilities. Something that can reserve, maintain, support these wind and solar energy power plants in case of bad weather, when they cannot operate. So we segregated two types of power plants. First is biogas. Ukraine is an agricultural country, and we have a lot of fuel for this type of power plants, and highly maneuverable gas power plants of a new type, so-called gas speakers, which are capable of guaranteeing Ukrainian supplier with uninterrupted power supply, because they are always ready to pick up in case the wind or solar power plant ceases or suspends the generation of electric power. Also, we pay a lot of attention to accumulation of electric power, which allows us during the times of excessive generation, when we get this power from solar or wind power plants in spring or summer, we just can pump that energy into the power storage and use it in the evening to cover the consumption. And obviously we should pay better attention to the development of hydraulic power plants, which is the best balancer of power grid for the time being. Thus, for the future, we have certain investment menu. We have a clear understanding of what power generating facilities we need to build and what are the investments required for that. In the majority of cases, as a country, we should count on private investments, and we can only raise them if we create a relevant market environment in the country, so those investments get their returns. And for the investors, we should ensure three main conditions to make sure that the transformation of our power grid happens properly. First, the absence of the indebtedness in the market. On the balancing market, first of all, where the balancing facilities operate, and on the market of systemic services. Now we've fully covered the indebtedness on the systemic services. The work on the balancing market requires a little bit more effort, but it's underway. The second thing we have to implement is the contracts for the auxiliary services. So after the investor constructs their power plant, they know that within the next 3 to 5 years they have clear income against which they can take loan in Ukrainian or foreign bank. We're talking about bankability here. Bankability of those projects, their capability to be eligible to the banks for lending. And on top of that, we have to synchronize our market rules with the rules of European markets, 100% synchronization, so that Ukrainian or foreign investor that builds a power plant or power accumulation facility, they understand that those new signals in the market, they stimulate them to construction of such facilities. The price should be fluctuating even within the day to properly reimburse these flexibility for those power plants that are capable of generating energy at the moment necessary for the power grid. And the investors should also be aware of the fact that Ukrainian market is united with European, that they enter not only Ukrainian market but European market, that they enter European market through Ukraine, and thus Ukraine will have advantages even comparing with our neighbors, because we are ready to construct the power plants even faster, probably at lower price, and this is when Ukraine can become a magnet for investments in energy sector, and those investments will bring us to safer and more secure power grid, to the power grid that will be cheaper for consumers, and all in all should give a momentum for the development and competitiveness in all Ukrainian economy. Do I understand it properly that there is no place for nuclear power plants in this system? No, there is a place for this, and according to our calculations, we will need additional nuclear power plants capacity. We all hope the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to get back under Ukrainian control as soon as possible. We have reserves to increase the capacity of existing nuclear power plants. And obviously you are aware of the plans to construct the new reactors for the nuclear power plants. Those are the long-term plans. But in Ukrainian power grid, the capacity generated by nuclear power plants will be of demand. Specifically, if we talk about decommissioning of obsolete power plants such as coal-powered power plants. Thank you. So let's get back to the more urgent topics such as power generation. Are we going to depend on the import of electric power, and if so, do we have any coordination with our foreign partners in this regard? The current generation is sufficient to cover the demand across the country. Within the weeks or days to come, we don't see any problems about that. Obviously, this is the situation given without account of potential enemy strikes, but for the time being the generation is sufficient, and currently we quite confidently cope with the current load on the power grid. The mainway network operated by Ukrenergo has no bottlenecks. We are ready to deliver electric power to all the consumers in all regions of Ukraine without any delays. After we go through autumn-winter maximum consumption peaks, maybe when the temperature falls below 10 degrees, minus 10 degrees below zero, well, we will probably have to resort to import in that case. But what we've done for that is we united our power grid with the power grid of Europe. This year we've increased the capability of import of electric power from 500 to 1200 megawatts. We are in negotiations with our European colleagues to have this increased amount of import, but the main problem currently is that the transferring capability of import that Ukraine possesses is used at very low percentage, and it's not related to some organizational or technical reasons, but more to the reasons of economic nature that have to be mitigated. I mean, the difference in price on Ukrainian and European market, when the Ukrainian electric power on the market is cheaper for businesses than the European one. We've mentioned it multiple times that we either have to identify the mechanism for compensation of negative difference for the importer or to liberalize prices on the market. So one way or another, those mechanisms should start working, not only to survive the winter, but also for the Ukrainian power grid to have this backup, this support in case of any emergency, so we could safely import electric power from Europe in our conditions when the enemy tries to influence the result of the war by shelling the civil infrastructure and terror of millions of people, millions of citizens, of peaceful population. This support is increasingly necessary. So this winter, should the Ukrainians expect for the power shutdowns, and what are the conditions for that to start? Well, it can happen in case of massive strikes on the energy infrastructure, in case the last year's scenario repeats. But look, we're in the middle of November now, and we haven't seen any supermassive attacks on the power grid. However, the power grid is being shelled on a daily basis, specifically in the forward edge of the battle area, in those regions, not somewhere in the depth of a country. So these energy shutdowns, they may happen that during the days of high consumption, when we will have to resort to emergency backup and our neighboring countries won't have such a backup, that may result in some deficit of electric power. But I'm convinced that allowing the shutdowns due to some economic reasons is unacceptable. Well, the security defense forces report that the enemy keeps accumulating the missiles. They've accumulated more than 800 of them, so the missile strikes are probably going to happen. So how are we ready to this scenario? Well, we've been preparing to this scenario since the end of the last winter. In a number, we've prepared in different aspects. First, our air defense forces are way better equipped. The density of air defense is way bigger than the previous period, and obviously we have a lot of experience. Not only Ukrenergo, but Volodymyr, the power plants, they have the developed protocols in case of damage of power plant X or substation Y. All those protocols were updated this year before the winter. So in terms of organization, we are very well prepared. Also, we have to understand that critical infrastructure facilities in the regions are way better equipped with generators, the engineering protection, than the previous year. So we are stronger on the level of individual consumers, on the regional level, and on the level of power grid operator. We know well what to do. And I have to tell you, in the end of summer, in the beginning of this autumn, I had a tour around all of the regions. We had meetings with Ukrenergo, with the military governors, and it looks like everybody knows very well what to do in different situations. So yes, don't take it too light. The problems may arise. 800 missiles is a huge resource to produce some damage or inflict some damage on our power grid. But don't panic, there may be difficulties, but the power grid is going to survive any attacks by the enemy. And we're going to enter the next sprint with lights on and the operating power grid. Well, thank you for this optimistic outlook. Let's give our journalists opportunity to ask their questions. Please, Vladislav Opuch, Ukrinform Detect made a statement that they recently won a court or won a proceedings against Russian Federation in The Hague and for compensation for the captured and destroyed property in the temporarily occupied territories. I know that Ukrenergo is preparing the same case, and we understand that probably not exactly, but are we able to calculate the losses and damage inflicted by Russian Federation? Well, we've brought the case to the court about 3 years ago, but the principal difference is that Russia has changed the tactics of their protection. For example, if the previous cases brought by DTEC and Oshad Bank, their tactics was just not to show up, as if they don't recognize the jurisdiction of the arbitrary court on that situation and over themselves as a state that is a signatory of an agreement on investment partnership with our state. And in case of Ukrenergo and other companies that temporarily lost their assets in Crimea, they try to debunk the arguments or protect using the reasons that they don't submit to the jurisdiction. So basically they want to prove that we've brought the case to the wrong court. So this process is very long. Unfortunately, the arbitrary course practice is such. There are certain complexities related to the amount of those cases, and I'm not disclosing the exact figures, but we're talking about hundreds of millions of euro in Crimea alone. I'm sure we will win these arbitrary proceedings, but it will take longer than in case of our colleagues. And what about those losses inflicted during the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation? Well, now we're preparing the evidence base, anything we can put together, not to bring this case to the court just for the tick, but so we're confident in our victory. Obviously, we're going to fight for any damaged isolator and switch on our substations. But talking about the territory of Ukraine in whole, about temporarily occupied territories, apart from Crimea, I think that that amount will reach billions. Well, you've mentioned $500 million of funds raised by the end of the year. Do you plan to raise more funds, and how they will be used? We plan to raise about 150 to 200 million euro with the grant component from EBRD. Also, we plan to sign the memorandum by the end of this year on cooperation. Well, the memorandum was signed this year, and by the end of this year we plan to sign the loan agreement. We're on the stage of finalizing it with the bank, and I hope within the next couple of weeks we are about to sign it. Do we have any more questions? Good afternoon. Online question from Lead Bank. On the way of accession to EU, we are expected to implement reforms in the area of energy, just like transition to the green energy. So how do you estimate the reforms suggested by EU? Are they real? Well, talking about the transition to green energy, the second slide that I've demonstrated, it was about it, among big European power grids, and Ukraine is a big European power grid. It falls under the category of big power grids. It may become the first one to fulfill the green transition. We have very good competitive advantages for this. First of all, it's a big fraction of nuclear generation, and what we have to do is to replace the coal-powered thermal power plants and electric power plants to that mix that I've demonstrated in the slides. So that mix is aimed at replacing those coal-powered power plants and gas-powered power plants or thermal power plants. You know, they were all, or most of them were damaged. Some of the reactors were destroyed. So it's something inevitable for us. The question is only when we recognize this reality and when we start, when we stop resisting it, and when we start raising those investments quickly. So the PSOs are temporary in their nature. It's not only something for the population. We have other obligations, special obligations, for example, obligation to cover compensation of the green tariff. And the term of those special obligations expires in 2022. There are other special obligations, and this year I would like to avoid some import PSO because it's the movement in the wrong direction. But one way or another, the liberalization of the market is inevitable for us, because next year we are going to unite the markets when basically a Ukrainian manufacturing facility submitting their application to the energy stock. They submit that application not to Ukrainian market but to Ukrainian, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, Romanian regional market, and to achieve it we need at least 1 to 2 years to unite our markets. But unification of the markets will mean that we will have no specific conditions of operation of Ukrainian market. So conditionally saying, the price caps, the rules will be the same as in the neighboring countries, because technically these market mechanics are not going to work. So those requirements are absolutely real to fulfill, and they will be absolutely for the benefit of Ukrainian citizens and businesses, because they will transform the power grid to make it not only more protected, but it will result in the cheaper prices for our consumers. Thank you very much for such an optimistic outlook. I think that it will really help us during the winter. I'm reminding you, joining us was Volodymyr Kudrytskyi, chairman of the board of national energy company Ukrenergo, and we were talking about the protection of our power grid against Russian terror. We're putting the schedule for the next week, putting together the schedule for the next week. Thank you for staying tuned.